Max Harper had always been the type of person who saw the world a little differently. Growing up in a modest apartment on the edge of Silicon Valley, he'd spent his teenage years tinkering with computers, fascinated by how digital tools could solve real-world problems. But unlike many of his peers, Max didn't have an endless stream of venture capitalists knocking on his door. His background was unremarkable. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked as a receptionist. They didn't understand his obsession with technology, but they supported him anyway. He went to college on a scholarship, majoring in computer science, but finance and accounting were foreign languages to him. In fact, Max had no interest in them at all. What he did have was an idea. It came to him during a late-night hackathon in his college dorm, a way to revolutionize personal finance management using machine learning. Max wasn't just thinking about an app, he was thinking about an ecosystem. His app would simplify budgeting, investment tracking, and even automate savings, all in one seamless platform. It would be a personal finance assistant powered by artificial intelligence. People wouldn't have to learn about finances. They would just have good finances, thanks to Max's app. The concept was brilliant. So simple, so elegant. He spent every waking hour refining it, working with a small group of developer friends to get the prototype off the ground. They had no funding, no experience in launching a product, and no understanding of the logistics behind running a company. But Max had something else: ambition. The kind that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. When the prototype was ready, Max did what any young, hungry entrepreneur would do. He launched it. He built a simple landing page, shared it on social media, and posted about it in a few online tech forums. The response was overwhelming. Within days, people were signing up faster than he could manage. Word spread like wildfire. It seemed like everyone wanted a piece of what he was offering. Max was ecstatic. This was it. This was his big break. Investors started reaching out. They liked his vision, his passion, and above all, they liked the growth numbers. His app was gaining traction, and he was suddenly on their radar. Max didn't think much about the mechanics of running a business. He didn't have time to. He was consumed with the product, the features, the expansion. As the app gained users, his focus was on adding more, faster. He recruited a small team to help with customer support, bug fixes, and marketing. Every new user was a victory, a step closer to his ultimate goal of revolutionizing personal finance. He signed a seed investment deal with a venture capitalist who promised to help take the app to the next level. The money was significant, enough to hire a larger development team, expand the product's features, and push for more aggressive user acquisition. But Max didn't look at it as a lifeline. To him, the funding wasn't a resource to sustain the business. It was a tool to fuel growth. The app wasn't just a product. It was a movement. And movements didn't slow down for anyone. Focus on growth, his investors told him. Keep adding features, keep acquiring users. You're going to change the world. And so Max did just that. He threw his entire focus into scaling, more marketing campaigns, more partnerships, bigger events. He hired top-tier engineers, recruited a high-priced sales team, and brought in a designer to overhaul the user interface. Every day, the numbers grew. The app's user base expanded by thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. But even as the growth was astronomical, the money didn't seem to come. Max didn't notice at first. Money was just an afterthought. The app had the potential to make millions, billions even. He was sure of it. As long as the users kept coming, the revenue would eventually follow. He didn't need to worry about margins or cash flow. He was too busy dreaming of the next big milestone. Every new user felt like a step toward changing the world, toward fulfilling his destiny as a tech mogul. One night, as Max sat in his office, watching the user count tick upward in real time, he received an email from his CFO, Tina. She had been hired a few months ago, brought in to help manage the company's finances. The email was brief. Max, we need to talk. We're running low on cash and we're burning through our reserves faster than expected. I need to know where we're heading with this. You've got to slow down on spending until we figure out a more sustainable path. This growth is unsustainable without the right strategy. Max skimmed the email. He didn't have time for distractions. More users were signing up, the buzz was growing louder, and the investors were pleased with the numbers. Slow down? He didn't think so. "I'll deal with it later," he muttered to himself, closing the email and turning back to the data on his screen. The startup dream was alive, and to Max, that meant everything else would fall into place. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Max barely slept. Every waking moment was dedicated to expanding the app. More features, more users, more buzz. His team grew as well, from a handful of developers to a full-fledged company with a marketing department, customer service, and a product team. The office space expanded, and the walls were decorated with sleek posters of their app's logo and slogans like "Revolutionize your finances" and "Empowering your financial freedom." Max's calendar was packed with meetings, investors, potential partners, media outlets wanting to feature the app. And with every new milestone, more users, more press, more attention, the pressure mounted. But it was a pressure Max was used to. It felt like the closer he got to his dream, the more he needed to push. The problem was, his relentless focus on growth had begun to create cracks in the foundation. One Friday afternoon, Tina, the CFO, called him into her office. The office was bare, with just a desk and a few filing cabinets. Efficient, but unremarkable. Tina had short brown hair, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, and a look in her eyes that told Max she wasn't about to sugarcoat anything. "Max, we need to have a serious conversation," she said, her voice tight with urgency. He sat down in the chair opposite her, barely able to hide his impatience. "What's going on?" "You're burning through cash faster than we can replenish it. Your spending is out of control. Our customer acquisition costs are astronomical, and we haven't been able to monetize in a sustainable way. I've gone over the numbers multiple times, and I can't ignore it anymore." Max shrugged, dismissing her concern with a wave of his hand. "We're growing. Fast. That's what matters right now. Investors are happy. The users are pouring in. Who cares about the cost right now? We can fix it later. I know what I'm doing." Tina's expression hardened, but she didn't back down. "The money isn't endless, Max. We're not going to be able to raise another round if we don't show a clear path to profitability. And we're running out of runway. You need to take this seriously." Max's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who wasn't in the trenches building the product. "You're just focused on the numbers." "I'm focused on the future. We're going to be the next big thing, and once we hit that tipping point, the revenue will come flooding in." Tina sighed, her face tight with frustration. "Max, I get it. I really do. But there are realities in running a business. You can't ignore them forever. Right now, we're losing money every day, and every new user costs more than what we're bringing in. That's not sustainable. If we don't fix this soon, we're going to burn through our cash reserves and be left with nothing but a product that no one can afford to use." Max didn't want to hear it. The numbers felt abstract to him. A distraction from the real mission. "I don't need to focus on that right now. We've got momentum, Tina. This is the big one. Once we've hit that critical mass, everything will fall into place. Trust me." But Tina didn't trust him, and Max could feel that trust slipping away with each passing day. "I don't want to be the one to say this," Tina continued, her voice softer but no less urgent. "But if you keep pushing the way you are, we're going to run out of time before we ever see that big one you're talking about. You can't keep ignoring the basics. Cash flow, expenses, margins, it's all tied together." Max shifted in his seat, a sinking feeling starting to form in his chest, but he refused to acknowledge it. "I know what I'm doing," he said, repeating it more to himself than to Tina. "We'll scale first. We'll figure out the rest later." Tina stared at him for a long moment, her concern clearly etched on her face. "I hope you're right, Max. But if you don't listen now, you might not have the chance to figure it out later." Max stood up abruptly, his heart pounding as the weight of her words hung in the air. He didn't have time to think about the logistics. Not when they were so close to making it. "Let's talk about this later," he said, before walking out of the room. He didn't want to deal with it. Not now. The weeks after that conversation felt like a blur. Max pushed forward, hyper-focused on growth. The marketing campaigns grew bolder. They hosted massive product launches, filled arenas with fans and press. The user numbers were climbing, but the tension behind the scenes was palpable. Tina's warnings, Ben's frustration, and the mounting pressure from investors, it was all starting to weigh on Max, though he refused to admit it. One evening, as Max looked over another round of growth metrics, his phone buzzed with a new email. It was from one of his investors, a seasoned venture capitalist who had been with the company since the seed round. Max opened it, bracing himself for another congratulatory message or another request for more user growth stats. But instead it read, "Max, I've been following your progress closely, and we're all impressed with how fast things are moving. That being said, I need to know your plans for profitability. The path we're on, burning through cash without a clear revenue model, doesn't work in the long term. We need to see a roadmap to profitability, not just numbers on a screen. I'll be in touch soon to discuss this further." Max stared at the email for a long moment. The familiar feeling of panic was creeping up on him again. He'd ignored Tina's advice, brushed off Ben's warnings, but this was different. This was one of his most significant investors. And if Rick was starting to question the strategy, things might be worse than Max had realized. But instead of confronting it, he pushed the thought aside. "I'll figure it out later," he muttered, hitting reply to send a generic, optimistic message about how they were growing fast and everything was on track. The next day, the tension seemed to come to a head. The servers crashed under the pressure of millions of new users. Customer complaints flooded in. There were bugs everywhere, and users were furious. The product, which had once seemed sleek and perfect, was now a mess of broken features and failed promises. Max paced back and forth in his office, feeling the walls close in. His team scrambled to fix the issues, but the damage was done. The feedback was pouring in from every angle. Users who had once loved the app were now leaving in droves, and the tech press was starting to turn on them. Max realized that, for the first time, the growth he had chased so relentlessly might actually be the thing that brought them down. It happened faster than Max could have ever anticipated. One morning, as he walked into the office with his usual rush of energy, ready to tackle another day of user acquisition and new features, he was met with an email that felt like a punch to the gut. "We regret to inform you that we are unable to extend any further funding to your company at this time due to concerns over cash flow, revenue, and sustainability. We encourage you to take immediate steps to rectify the situation." It was from his lead investor, the one who had believed in him from the beginning. Max froze, staring at the screen. He could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him. He had known this moment was coming. The warnings had been there, flashing like red lights. But seeing it in writing, seeing that they were pulling out, hit him harder than he ever could have imagined. He snapped his laptop shut and stood up, pacing around the small office space. His team, who had been working at full speed to launch the app's next big feature, looked up as he stormed past, sensing the shift in the air. "Max, what's going on?" Tina asked, stepping into his office, her voice tight with concern. He couldn't look her in the eye. "We're done," he muttered, his voice hollow. "The investor pulled out. We're out of money." The color drained from Tina's face, and she stared at him for a long moment, as if hoping he was joking. But he wasn't. The reality was sinking in. "You were right," he said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't listen. I didn't do what needed to be done." Tina shook her head. "This was never just about the investors, Max. We've been losing money for months. You didn't see it because you were too focused on user growth, on adding features. We can't keep running a business on dreams." Max felt the sting of truth in her words. He had been blinded by ambition. The idea of revolutionizing personal finance had consumed him, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that a business wasn't just a product. It was a living, breathing thing that needed proper care, management, and, most importantly, financial stability. He walked out of his office and into the open space where his team was gathered. The atmosphere had shifted. An unsettling quiet hung over the room. His employees were standing by, unsure of what was happening. "Listen up," Max said, his voice shaky but firm. "We've hit a wall. Our funding's been cut off, and we've got no way to keep going at this pace. We're shutting down." There was a collective gasp, followed by a heavy silence. People exchanged looks, their faces a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "We've been working our butts off," Ben, the lead developer, said, his voice low. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you make us aware of the risks sooner?" Max opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had no good explanation. He had led them all into this mess, thinking that passion and growth could solve everything. But now the reality of failure, his failure, was settling in. He wasn't just losing an app, he was losing his team, his vision, and the trust of the people who had believed in him. Hours later, the doors to the office were locked. The lights dimmed. Max sat alone in his office, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a promising startup. The flashy monitors, the piles of paperwork, the whiteboards filled with sketches and plans, none of it mattered now. The app was gone. The investors were gone. And so were the dreams of becoming the next tech mogul. Max had never felt so alone. As the days passed, the news broke. His startup was folding. The media that had once hailed him as a visionary now mocked him for his naivety. Articles flooded the internet, dissecting his rise and fall. The story of a young entrepreneur with a groundbreaking idea who couldn't manage the business side. The headlines were merciless. He avoided the phone calls from his team, from investors, from the press. What was there left to say? He had made every mistake in the book, ignoring financial fundamentals, focusing on growth at all costs, disregarding the advice of people who knew better. And now, as the dust settled, Max realized how much he had overlooked. Late one night, as he sat on his couch scrolling through his phone, he came across an old article about a different tech entrepreneur. This person had once been in Max's position, an outsider with a great idea, a ton of ambition, and a fast-growing startup. But this entrepreneur had focused just as much on the numbers as the vision, on profitability as much as on scaling. The article outlined how, after years of hard work, they had built a sustainable company, and it was still thriving. That was the key Max had missed: sustainability. Growth was important, but it had to be managed carefully. Building something that lasted meant balancing ambition with practicality. It meant taking the time to understand the numbers, even if they weren't as exciting as the tech. Max had wanted the glory, the headlines, the funding, the success, but he had neglected the core of what made a business strong: steady growth, reliable cash flow, and making tough, responsible decisions. He thought about Tina's warning, about Ben's plea to slow down, and about all the other signs he had ignored. The truth was, he had been so caught up in the idea of success that he hadn't paused to understand what it actually took to succeed. The bankruptcy wasn't just a financial failure. It was a wake-up call. Max knew he had a long road ahead if he ever wanted to rebuild his career. It wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't change the past. All he could do now was learn from it. As the weeks passed, Max began to take the first steps toward that process. He sought out mentors, attended business seminars, and, most importantly, began to educate himself on the fundamentals of finance. He started to understand what he had done wrong, and slowly he began to put together a plan for his next venture. One that wasn't just about the dream. This time, it would be about the work. The real work. And he would make sure, above all else, that it would be sustainable.